A very big welcome to this seminar featuring Professor Laura Kang, who will present on her remarkable book, Traffic in Asian Women. My name is Shireen Razak, and I'm the Penny Canner Endowed Chair in Women's Studies in the Department of Gender Studies at UCLA. I'm wearing several hats this morning as the Chair of Gender Studies. I'd like to welcome you to this talk as the first in a series of talks on transnational feminism, which is being organized by Professor Zeynep Korkman and Alisa Bierria. This talk also inaugurates a workshop of the Racial Violence Hub, which is a virtual gathering of feminist scholars, a hub I direct. The hub has a yearly workshop, which prior to the pandemic was in person. This year, we bring together 14 feminist scholars who will present monthly, each one monthly, on the theme of feminist approaches to theorizing genocidal violence, wars, and occupations. So the theme emerged because we wanted to think collectively about the continuous sexualized targeting and killing of Indigenous women, the disposability of populations through wars and occupations, institutionalized anti-Blackness resulting in police killings, a prison industrial complex, an unrelenting assault on a number of communities. Feminist scholars know that a historicized analysis of race, class, gender, and sexuality that is deeply attentive to imperialism, colonialism, and the afterlives of the transatlantic slave trade remain crucial for understanding the necropolitics we see everywhere. So this series is the 5th annual workshop, and we really wanted to think about, in writing about violence, how do we think about the politics of genocidal violence, the interconnections between its different registers, the transnational links between genocidal states. How do we write about this violence without spectacularizing it and trading in pain and suffering? How do we minimize harm to the families and communities we write about? How do we understand the specific context of racial violence, its geopolitical coordinates, its relationship to history? So, and of course, important to this is how to understand resistance. So Professor Kang's work opens the series for reasons that will become quickly obvious during her talk. And I want to just briefly outline a couple of themes in her work that have significant implications for this series. Professor Kang asks a number of important questions, among them, how and why did Asian women, a category that she painstakingly unpacks, become, in her words, intelligible through particular modes of documenting their violation and violability. Through the example of Korean women forced to become prostitutes for the Japanese Imperial Army between 1938 and the end of the war in 1945, an estimated 100,000 or so, 80% of whom were Korean, Professor Kang asks, and I feel that she asked this especially of feminists, what did this privileging of spectacularly and especially violated female bodies foreclose and render unintelligible? Asian women are made visible through this example, but in ways that also render them invisible as subjects governed by other forces. So how do these bodies in pain obscure others? What does the spectacle of the female body in pain do? So the comfort system, as it became known, has long been characterized by many Korean feminists as a case of genocide against Korean people. What are the implications of thinking about the comfort system, in quotation marks, as a case of genocidal racism? So there could be no better beginning to a series that is deliberately framed under the rubric of genocidal violence. In this series, we ask, what does the frame of genocide make visible and what does it obscure? I was taken with a point in the book where we are asked to think about the fact, does the discovery of a mass grave of 30 Korean women in Tenchang, China, near the border with Myanmar, make any difference to how we understand the comfort system? And then I would add, does it make any difference to how we understand genocide and genocidal violence? The second final point I want to make is that we announce in this series, because it is a series of the Racial Violence Hub, that we want to pay attention to the gendered and racial discourses of genocide. Professor Kang will tell us a lot about the category woman and the frame gender-based violence. She asks what it means when bodies become visible not only as injured corporeality, but bodies whose injury is known only as sexual violence. Her penetrating attention to, I like that phrase, the epistemological habits that divide the world into modern and pre-modern, that position states as sometimes as protectors of women rather than as governing through the violence. These things provide important instructions for those of us wanting to think about genocidal violence through a race-critical and feminist lens. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Laura Kang. Her talk is entitled Traffic in Asian Women, Categorical Violence and Innumerable Loss. Laura Hyun-Yi Kang is professor and former chair of the Department of Gender and Sexuality Studies at the University of California at Irvine. She is the author of Traffic in Asian Women, published by Duke in 2020, and Compositional Subjects, Enfiguring Asian American Women, also published by Duke in 2002. Professor Kang will speak for about 45 minutes, and this will be followed by questions. We would ask that you pose your questions and comments in the chat, and then I will moderate and call on you to ask your question directly to Professor Kang. So.
Thank you, Shireen. Thank you to everyone in the audience today. Before I begin, I want to thank Shireen Razak for the invitation to kick off the 5th annual Racial Violence Hub workshop series on feminist approaches to theorizing genocidal violence, wars, occupations, and the Transnational Feminist series of the Department of Gender Studies. I also understand that students in the seminar on epistemologies of gender have read the book and are in attendance. So I will try to speak to these 3 rubrics in some way. I'm going to be doing, before I do the screen share of my PowerPoint, I want to say just an explanation of the title of the subtitle of the talk. Especially, by categorical violence, I point to the contradictory meanings of absolute unqualified violence on the one hand, and also a specific system of classifying categories of violence on the other. My book, Traffic in Asian Women, tries to think through that contradiction by examining the discursive circulation of Asian women, and specifically through the case of Japanese military sexual slavery during World War II. So let me share my slide. So the book is organized into 3 sections. For those of you who haven't had a chance to read it, the introduction lays out a story of how Asian women, and more specifically the case of Asian comfort women, emerged as a spectacular and stirring case of both female injury and transnational justice in the 1990s. But then the first chapter, titled Asian Women as Method with a question mark, casts doubt on the account of visibility and justice, or visibility as justice, in the introduction. Instead, I propose Asian women as a figure of non-knowing, or a more vexing and intractable puzzle, or problematic. There are 2 allied components of the body of the book. The first section considers 3 prominent categories of gendered abuse, traffic in women, sexual slavery, and violence against women. The second section considers these demands for, three demands for and modes of redress: the disclosure of truth, monetary compensation, and lasting memorialization. One question that the book raises and that I am still grappling with is how much of the terms and conditions of the institutionalization of specific categories of violence have also predetermined and constrained the way we can articulate, but also imagine their remedy and proper redress. By innumerable loss, then, I refer to both what cannot be numerically quantified and collated, and what cannot be easily demarcated, contained, and resolved once and for all. So even as many noted its singular and undeniable cruelty, the case of Japanese military sexual slavery was upheld as illustrative and even exemplary of many categories of gendered and racial violence and human rights violation after it came to international attention at the beginning of the 1990s. Throughout the decade, the Come for Women redress movement contributed importantly to various international campaigns to codify wartime rape, forced prostitution, sexual slavery, and violence against women. At the United Nations, it was addressed and debated in May of 1992 at the Working Group on Contemporary Forms of Slavery, and then again at the Subcommission on Prevention of Discrimination and Protection of Minorities in August. At the June 1993 World Human Rights Conference in Vienna, Japanese military sexual slavery was prominently featured at the Non-Governmental Tribunal and consequently shaped the formulation of Article 38 of the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action, which explicitly states that violations of the human rights of women in situations of armed conflict are violations of the fundamental principles of international human rights and humanitarian law, unquote. At the Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing in 1995, the final platform of action identified rape in the conduct of armed conflict as a war crime and called on the United Nations to, quote, undertake a full investigation of all acts of violence against women committed during war, including rape, in particular systematic rape, forced prostitution, and other forms of indecent assault and sexual slavery, and prosecute all criminals responsible for war crimes against women, and finally, to provide full redress to women victims. As this only partial list demonstrates, but it's partial, but still rather crowded, the Come for Women problematic importantly shaped the categorization and recalibration of human rights violations in need of proper certification, documentation, and adjudication by the United Nations and newer entities such as the International Criminal Court. As Indai Lourdes Sajor, a prominent activist, enumerated this expansive relevance of the issue in 2000, quote, based on the testimonies given by the Asian Come for Women, it is evident that more than one crime has been committed against every woman. Evidence points to crimes of rape, murder, abduction, forced labor, kidnapping, sexual slavery, torture, racial discrimination, forced sterilization, massacre, and genocide. Beyond the horrific details of its brutality and massive scale, the outrage that the testimonies and archival disclosures in the early 1990s engendered also raised questions about why the comfort system had not been addressed and examined for so long. If we keep in mind that the institutional recognition and codification of wartime rape in the 1990s transpired long after the past event, but also importantly through its belated remembering, we might reconsider the common move of looking back upon the Japanese military comfort system to highlight those specific features that most clearly qualify as instances of these late defined categories of violence. I think which creates, both a visibility and a new kind of unintelligibility. Through such a retroactive classificatory method, Asian comfort women can only ever be particular demonstrative embodiments of those categories of violence. In order to properly qualify under those categories, however, both the Japanese military comfort system and, more importantly, the Asian women victims must be reduced or transfigured according to these narrow terms of legibility. Although many have upheld the comfort women case as exemplary of both the past violation and contemporary empowerment of Asian women, I argue that it has profoundly destabilized the imaginary unity and conceptual demarcation of the category. For instance, when underscored as a method of racist colonial genocide against Koreans, the comfort system brings to the fore the underexplored matter of racial, ethnic, and national differences and hierarchies among Asian women. From early on in the redress movement, Korean activists and scholars underscored this intra-Asian racism and categorized the Japanese military comfort system as genocidal. So these are two, I think, important early scholarly articulations of the comfort system as genocidal. In 1993, Alice Hyun, in one of the earliest articles published about the Japanese military comfort systems, noted that it may be postulated that Japan's institutionalization of 정신대 죽은 위안부 was one facet of its attempt to control the Korean population by assimilation on the one hand and dispersal overseas on the other. She added, some have even speculated that the 정신대 policy was genocidal insofar as it left thousands of young Korean women of childbearing age infertile. In her incisive essay in the 1997 special issue on comfort women, on Japanese military sexual slavery in the journal Positions, East Asia Cultures Critique, Korean scholar Hyun pointed to the Korean Council's characterization of the Japanese military comfort system as, quote, the genocide of the Korean people, unquote, and further underscored its racist motivation and design. Quote, according to Young, I conceive of the crime as a case of genocide, not only in terms of uprooting the reproductive capability of young women, but also as an attempt to deplete the Korean ethnic identity, unquote. Later in the essay, Yang declared even more strongly, the Japanese categorization of Korean as a valueless race was a significant dimension in building the project. As evident in both passages, the imprimatur of genocide binds the victims to biological and generational reproduction and reinvests in their value as young, fertile women. And so, maybe during the Q&A, I still feel like it's a kind of a matter for further deliberation of, what does it mean to categorize the comfort system as genocidal, as a case of genocidal racism? So rather than reach for an accurate representation or definitive diagnosis, Traffic in Asian Women demonstrates how the stunted, belated, and still very contested recognition of the violence of the Japanese military comfort system incriminates a longer and more jagged history of international maneuvers to categorize, document, and regulate female vulnerability, and their often dubious, eccentric, exclusionary delineation of Asian women. So instead of grasping comfort women as exemplary, I propose to recast it as a multivalent problematic, activated and foreclosed by certain modes of expertise, contestation, and non-knowing within a particularly American power knowledge regime. The book attempts to trace the peculiar composition, but also the multiple effacement then of Asian women within a larger geohistorical arc of the emergence, decline, and permutation of the US. So the book is very much, in some ways, a story of the kind of the emergence of US imperial power in the course of the 20th century. So I want to kind of retain the focus on the US by discussing one chapter that really looks at kind of one wing of its power as it extends into the Asia Pacific through its US military involvement in the Asia Pacific War. The US state and military were particularly invested and also liable agents in the documentation, management, and forgetting of Japan's violent conscription, uprooting, and relocation of women throughout its Asia-Pacific empire. Several scholars have attributed the lack of will to recognize, prosecute, and problematize the Japanese military comfort system to its similarities and connections to the wartime rapes and institutionalized coordination of prostitution by the US military in its successive interventions in and occupation of Japan, Okinawa, Korea, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and the Philippines. So the World War II sightings of comfort girls by the US military began to be mentioned in the reminiscences and memoirs of veterans who served in the military in the Asia and Pacific Islands. This specific body of war literature includes the recollection of an extraordinary group of US veterans, Asian Americans who served as interpreters and US military intelligence specialists in the Asia Pacific War. The largest group were Nisei, over 6,000, and most of them were carefully screened and personally recruited from the various concentration camps in which Japanese Americans had been interned. The US military also strategically enlisted the linguistic services of a smaller number of Korean American and Japanese Americans for deciphering intercepted communications, translating captured documents, and performing intelligence work in combat areas, which included eavesdropping on Japanese soldiers' conversations, interpreting battlefront commands, producing and broadcasting propaganda, negotiating peaceful surrender, and most significantly, interrogating Japanese prisoners of war. In August 1944, two teams of Nisei interpreters would meet and interrogate a group of Korean women who had been taken to Burma in 1942 to work in the Japanese military comfort stations. This remarkable encounter between Asian American military linguists and Korean women who had been captured in North Burma and detained as prisoners of war was recorded in several US military documents and US Army Signal Corps photographs. These photographs and POW interrogation reports of the Korean women were produced earlier in time, but the peculiar terms and conditions of their composition, circulation, and archiving rendered them insignificant, and they went largely unnoticed until the Transnational Justice and Redress movement was inaugurated in the early 1990s. But even before, almost 2 decades, a full decade before the inauguration of the redress movement, these images of the women began to circulate in the US through these published memoirs. The history, beginning in the late 1970s, the history of Japanese Americans who served in US and Allied military intelligence during World War II was documented in a range of publications, largely because of the veterans' own efforts to recall and record their wartime work and experiences, and to share these memories with one another and a broader audience. An important early instance was the 1979 book titled Yankee Samurai, and we see this kind of very troubling and fascinating kind of cover of these kind of overlapping militarized imperialist images in this figure of the kind of the samurai and the U.S. soldier. Although Joseph Daniel Harrington is the credited author, the book is largely a compendium of vignettes culled from the memories of, and in some cases, already written accounts by many Nisei veterans. Yankee Samurai briefly mentions comfort girls in several places, and most remarkably, it features possibly the earliest appearance of a photographic image of Korean comfort women in an English language book. And this is, the example on the right. As you can see, this is a tightly cropped reproduction of a now familiar US Army Signal Corps photograph, which was taken in August 1944 of two Korean women who are seated on the ground with downcast eyes and another woman behind them. To either side of the women are two uniformed Asian American male soldiers whose bodies filled the left and right edges of the frame. The caption provided in Yankee Samurai reads, if you can see that, Charlie Chan and Grant Hirabayashi interrogate comfort girls. A detachment of them was captured after Myitkyina, Burma was overcome. In 1986, Wan Loi Chan, pictured in the photograph featured in Yankee Samurai, published his own account as a book titled Burma, The Untold Story. Although it is largely a conventional war memoir, the book contains a remarkable section subtitled The Comfort Girls, which provides a detailed account of his encounter with and interrogation of the Korean women in Myitkyina. Chan begins plaintively in this account. He says, there are no records of the Korean comfort girls. No one knows how many of these unfortunate young women were forced into prostitution by the Imperial Japanese forces during World War II. But then he continues with a lengthy, detailed description. And I'll just read a part of this. It says, thousands were killed during the bloody fighting in the Pacific, Southeast Asia, and elsewhere. Following the Japanese surrender, many were repatriated by the Allies, eventually returning to Korea. The Japanese destroyed all records of this chapter in the history of the imperial forces. Only a few photos remain today, unquote. The repeated references to lost and destroyed records works to enhance the shock effect and truth value of the large reproduction of 3 photographs of Korean women, 2 of them with Chan, which are featured in Burma, The Untold Story. So this is the same one that appears in Yankee Samurai, this image on the right that becomes represented in Chan's book. But as you can see that it's not as tightly cropped as it was in Harrington's book, but now is also actually captioned differently, foregrounding the Chinese American authorial subject. Captain Chan and Comfort Girls with Sergeant Hirabayashi in Myitkyina. And incidentally, and I can talk about this more later, it was actually this discrepancy between this slight discrepancy in framing and cropping between these 2 photos that led me to question how they were produced, archived, and disseminated. And I then kind of discovered this whole problem of the entire U.S. military archives. So I want to show you a couple more photographs. The second photo shows a larger group of the 20 Korean women. It also includes 2 other Japanese American military linguists identified as Howard Furumoto and Robert Honda that are featured in the captions. The third photo, dated a week earlier on August 3rd, 1944, shows a lone Korean woman being interrogated and is captioned, quote, Kim, the first comfort girl, taken prisoner at Michna. With Kim is Carl Yoneda of the OWI and a Japanese soldier who had also been captured with her. All three photos have been reprinted in many other texts, news stories, and countless websites. The large group photo has been most widely circulated, achieving a kind of iconic status. Like most others, I long took these photographs as visible evidence of the truth of the Japanese military comfort system. But these photos are also something else. They are the cruel and astounding trace of several intercutting histories of power, knowledge, violence, and exigency, as well as their indifferent and arbitrary documentation. A clearer reproduction of the original large group photo from the US National Archives brings new details into view. There is another female figure dressed in a kimono in the more shaded right, the right bottom corner of the image. And there's more women who were actually kind of cropped out in both the earlier appearances. The structure's now visible slanted roof and its more distinct barbed wires emphasize the carceral conditions of this setting. It could be and has been read as a snapshot of rescue and liberation. But as the US Signal Corps caption announces, this is a record of incarceration. This time space is also a switching point from the Japanese garrison of an occupied Burma to the Lido stockade of a colonized India, where these women will go after this photo has been taken, and where they will be further confined and interrogated by the United States Office of War Information, Psychological Warfare Branch. I propose to zoom out from this enlarged framing, not just optically, but also in terms of the broader historical, geopolitical, cultural, and governmental forces that came to bear upon the assembly of these bodies in this time space, the production of this photographic image, and its subsequent archiving, forgetting, and late retrieval. First, they attest vividly to the US military's contemporaneous awareness of the existence of the comfort stations, notably in and through such direct face-to-face encounters with the abused and traumatized women on the Asia-Pacific battlefield. Second, they are also the visible record of the cruel induction and strategic use of Asian Americans, and specifically Japanese Americans, by the US as especially qualified and exemplary agents of military intelligence and psychological warfare against the Japanese military. Third, approached as the execution of a particular US military practice of documentation and archiving, they suggest how the selective priorities and methods of this cosmology and episteme contributed to the effacement and unfathomability of the Korean women who were captured within its frame. These US Signal Corps photographs were part of a larger discovery of US military documents in the early 1990s, which also included prisoner of war interrogation reports, including most significantly a report titled Japanese Prisoner of War Interrogation Report number 49 on 20 Korean comfort girls, which was authored by Technical Sergeant Alex Yorichi, another one of these Japanese American soldiers who had been interned and then recruited from the concentration camps to serve in the US military. And these, both the prisoner of war interrogation reports and the Signal Corps photographs were initially hailed as providing credible third-party objective attestation of the existence of the Japanese military comfort stations, despite the Japanese government's initial denials that they existed. So reading each of these documents of the US military archive closely alongside and against each other, it becomes clear that these are also the records of the beginnings of US military intervention into and occupation of Asia. They incriminate the US military as an early knowing subject, selective scribe, and indifferent preservationist of the atrocities of the Japanese military comfort system. This was duly observed in several early publications. Ustinia Dolgopo and Sneha Paranjape, two authors who published a really important pamphlet by the International Commission of Jurists in 1994, actually, at a very early on they pointedly note these unsettling power knowledge implications. Quote, a disturbing facet of this story is that the Allied powers had compiled extensive documentary and other evidence immediately after the war about the comfort stations, the manner in which the women were recruited, and the vicious nature of the control the Japanese military had over the women. They also knew that comfort stations had been established throughout the Asia-Pacific region, and that Dutch, Korean, Chinese, Taiwanese, Filipino, Indonesian, Malaysian, and Burmese women had been victimized, unquote. George Hicks, another early historian of the comfort system, also questioned this early US military awareness and tacit tolerance of the Japanese military comfort system. As Hicks writes, quote, the comfort women were not unknown to the Allies, who had repatriated many. The United States Army had even, as mentioned, made a steady group of comfort women. And this is, I think, one of the more kind of troubling details that he doesn't actually elaborate upon, but Hicks says, and Allied soldiers had been known to take advantage of them. And he doesn't elaborate upon that. So it is crucial to understand that these were Japanese American subjects who acted as interrogators and translators of Korean women, categorized and treated as Japanese prisoners of war. So many books and articles on the comfort women problematic cite these and other US POW interrogation reports as incontrovertible evidence and official archival sources. But no one has paid any sustained attention to the peculiar fact that it was mostly Nisei and Kibei soldiers, many of them recruited from the US concentration camps, who conducted the interrogation reports and interrogations and composed the reports. I'm not going to go over the long discussion that I have in that chapter 5 on how actually a dispersed and a somewhat disorganized network of different international and national military agencies and authorities in the Asia-Pacific War contributed to the displacement and obscuring of these photographic and textual records of the Japanese military comfort system. But I want to note that the 20 Korean comfort girls captured in Machina, at each step of this kind of archival military documentary network that's sometimes overlapping and sometimes kind of divergent, is that at each step, those 20 Korean women pictured here and documented in that prisoner of war interrogation report, they undergo a certain mutation and gradual erasure. in that chain. And so, I want to kind of think about the kind of structures of military documentation and archiving as enacting a different kind of violent erasure of the women themselves. Both the capture and documentation and effacement and illegibility of the Korean women encountered on the battlefronts by the US military are then the symptoms and consequences of a peculiarly enfolded frame of comprehension, categorization, and prioritization. Rather than fixate upon and identify with the Korean women, I propose instead to kind of rethink both interrogation report number 49 and the Signal Corps photographs as distinctive yet unruly American compositions, which betray the US state's incoherent mix of racist mass incarceration and denationalization of Japanese Americans with its imperialist investment in and militarized commitment to Asia. The Allied campaign against the Japanese Imperial Army in North Burma in 1944 was notable for several historic, geopolitical, and ideological reasons. The Japanese invasion and occupation of Burma were significant as the westernmost extension of its territorial expansion across the Asia Pacific. But what really concerned the Allied forces about that extension was that it was a specifically pointed usurpation of British colonial rule, so that now the Japanese were kind of invading into Japanese colonial territories. And so this deployment of US soldiers to Burma was also significant and hailed as the first time that the US military combat troops had landed on the Asian mainland. So we can kind of think of this as a record of many, many significant events happening at this particular time space. So this is an image of the prisoner of war interrogation report. And so I end that chapter with a brief discussion of a fourth much touted, much circulated US Army Signal Corps photograph of 4 Korean women and a Chinese soldier, which was taken less than a month after those earlier photos on September 3rd, 1944. The Korean women, along with 1 Japanese woman, had been captured by Chinese troops after being subject to weeks of intense Allied bombings of a Japanese military base. They were kind of bunkered down in this series of underground caves, which had been carved into the Sangshan Hills of Yunnan, China. So the November 30th, 1944 issue of the CBI Roundup featured on the right in the slide, a newspaper published by the US Army for the soldiers in the China-Burma India campaign, as it was called, featured an article titled Jap Comfort Girls, written by Walter Rundle, a United Press correspondent. With a Japanese-speaking Chinese student who had escaped from Manchuria acting as interpreter, Rundle interviewed the 4 surviving Korean women, who were all from Pyongyang, about their living and working conditions. So some of the details that are written up by Rundle include, among other duties, they had to wash Japanese soldiers' clothing, cook their food, and clean out the caves in which they lived. They said they were paid nothing and received no mail from home. When Chinese troops attacked Sangshan, the girls lived below ground in caves. 14 of the original 24 were killed by shell fire. They said they had all been told they would be tortured if captured by the Chinese, and all admitted they had believed such stories, unquote. An earlier article in the CBI Roundup provides a clearer picture of the massive Allied bombing that the women in the photo had been subject to. Quote, Sangshan, Gibraltar of the Burma Road, just west of the Salween River, fell after 3 months of continuous assaults, during which the 2,000 defenders were virtually exterminated. Only a handful of prisoners were taken, including 5 women. In one instance, the Chinese literally blasted the Japs off the top of their mountain fortress by planting dynamite under their positions, unquote. The discordant smile of the Chinese soldier indicts the blithe disregard of the women's humanity on all sides of the war front. While no US ground forces were engaged in the Battle of Sangshan, the US supported the Chinese troops with aerial surveillance and bombings. And most significantly, the US military supplied the dynamite that was used. Finally, another inhuman detail of Signal Corps photo appears, number 230417, appears in the bureaucratic notations following the caption. So this is the original caption that was written. So there's this archival notation of, and so now I want us to focus less on the image, but it's captioning and archiving. So under that original caption, there's this archival notation that says, prisoners of war, Japanese women, photo released by Bureau of Public Relations, US War Department. How and why was this photo made to be circulated? At the end of his account of his interrogation of the Korean women in Myitkyina, Wang Loi-chan, the Chinese American soldier and author I cited earlier, notes, quote, the Allied press made a big thing of the comfort girls in sensational releases, unquote. Whose interests and what aims were served by such Allied public relations? The US National Archives continues to reveal new, more astonishing materials for the persistent researchers of the truth of the history of the Japanese military comfort system, which includes the harrowing survival of some women and the violent deaths of others on the multiple battlefronts of the Asia-Pacific War. In July 2017, a research team supported by the Seoul Metropolitan Government and the Seoul National University Human Rights Center discovered, quote, the first filmed evidence of comfort women found in the US archives. And actually, if we have time during the Q&A, I'll show the video clip of this film footage if people are interested. But it actually features some of the women from this particular photo of the bombing victims. Most recently, as Shireen referred to in her introduction, in February 2018, the same research team announced the discovery of a 19-second film clip of a mass grave of 30 Korean women in Tengchong, China, near the border with Myanmar. The footage had been filed on September 13th, 1944, by a cinematographer with the same US Army 164th Signal Corps. Although these photographs and film clips viscerally attest to the physical brutality that Korean women were subject to at this meeting and relay of racist military violence from Japanese imperialism to US imperialism, I want to end by suggesting, as I do in other parts of the book, that we pay attention to more mundane bureaucratic modes by which Korean women and Asian women have been disappeared or made insignificant, illegible, and incoherent. Here, I want to draw attention to the 2 captions of the photo in the US National Archives. The original caption refers to them as Japanese girls, and the notation, similarly identifies them as Japanese women. Even though the prisoner of war interrogation report identifies them as Koreans. And so the current title in the U.S. National Archives still retains this misidentification of the women as Japanese, but furthermore identifies them as Japanese prisoners. For me, what's also really troubling about these archival notations is the fact that they are part of a series titled Photographs of American Military Activities. So then we can kind of reapproach this image, not as just a kind of visible record of the Japanese military comfort system, but it's as a kind of visual record of U.S. imperialist military activities abroad. Oh, here's actually, maybe I will show this, because it's only 18 seconds long, but I think it's worth seeing. So what's, for me, really kind of moving about that, okay, about that particular video footage is actually how, even though the women are have been kind of cleaned up, how they seem to actually be so afraid of the camera itself. If, as the oft-repeated saying goes, the camera is a weapon, how might we review these U.S. Signal Corps photographs and their self-referential indifferent archiving as both a mode and record of US imperialist racial violence? I suggested earlier that we zoom out both spatially and temporally from the frame of the photograph of the women incarcerated in Myitkyina. Another optical and analytical shift we could make is to turn the gaze of the camera back onto the photographers of the US Signal Corps. I want to end with this one last slide of a different group portrait from the US military archives, which has continued to haunt me. This is one of the soldiers of the soldiers / photographers of the 164th US Signal Corps Company. If you look closely at the center, there is a lone Asian female seated in the Jeep. How does she come to be wedged in this crowd? What happened to her before and after this photograph?
Dylan, do you want to ask your question?
It wasn't really a question. It was more just honoring the, hey, what's up, Laura? This is so good. No, I just wanted to just say that you got my wheels turning and got me thinking about the kind of a larger context in which, Shireen, your question is posed, which is what to do with the apparatus of genocide, meaning beyond the juridical apparatus, right? Beyond even the kind of academic discourse around genocide. And you all got me thinking about the thing I've been kind of obsessed with for 25 years, which is how different communities of people make use of the term as a way to challenge and leverage people into grappling with an intensity of terror which doesn't fit kind of conventional liberal humanist description of like disparity or inequity or exclusion or discrimination or whatever the shit is people want to say, right? Mm-hmm. That the terms of genocide kind of get at something else, and at the same time that there's a kind of self-conscious around how they're intentionally misusing the term, but also unapologetically doing that as well. So,
Mhm.
so just your dialogue just now got me thinking about that and how this is part of it. So it's not really a question, but it's more just a kind of um, a sense of gratitude that I appreciate being encouraged to think once again about what to do with the term genocide, right?
Mhm.
And it like makes me think about how other collectives and communities of people that are in direct relations of like state terror are trying to make sense of it and trying to force others to make sense of it by utilizing the term and even kind of using the term within a poetry of of
Mhm.
um of something. I don't know. So it's not really a question, Laura. I just was thinking with
Yeah.
you on this more than anything
No,
else.
I like that. I mean, I'm interested to think about this as a poetics, or is that better than thinking about it as the rhetorics of genocide? But I do think that there is something about genocide that it's so. Stirring, and it's something that you can't, kind of, back away from, or make excuses for. And so, I do think that it does have that kind of force of saying, there's a way in which, maybe if we think about genocide in relation to violence, like the word I talked about, kind of bureaucratic violence or bureaucratic neglect, but it made me actually then think about the fact that, you know, maybe it also is, in some ways, the word violence has been so depleted of meaning because, you can use it to mean so many different things at such different scales, right? That genocide, the poetics of genocide is in some ways partially response to that kind of, in some ways, that kind of emptying out of the word violence. And so what do we have when we can't, we want to talk about violence, but we can't use the word violence. Like what is the word that we have left? I mean, and then you're like, okay, is genocide then, the last stop for us? What is the other word that we use that's even more forceful than that? But thank you, Dylan. I think that's really helpful to me.
That is a very appropriate point on which to end, because both your book and this presentation has sort of forced us to think about these categories: West, non-West, Asian woman, in terms of the circuits that actually produce them. You have such methodological sort of discipline about it, tracing exactly how these scripts are flowing, where they come from, and what is the work that they do. That I think that is the gift of this book. So I really want to thank you so much for opening the series with this brilliant talk, and thank you for your book. And thanks to the audience for the questions. And read the whole book if you haven't already. Thanks again, Laura.